Hit me. Hit me. Hit me. You can't do it.
There is a scene in Training Day where Denzel Washington leans back in a lowrider, rolls the window down just enough to let the Los Angeles heat in, takes a long drag from a blunt, and looks at Ethan Hawke like he just asked the dumbest question in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department. And in that single moment, you already know this man is going to destroy every room he walks into for the next 2 hours. You already know something is deeply wrong with Detective Alonzo Harris. You already know this movie is going to be different. Training Day came out in October 2001, and it hit American audiences like a freight train. It was raw, it was loud, it was unapologetic, and it gave us one of the most terrifying, seductive, layered villain performances ever committed to film. But behind all of that, behind the King Kong speech and the dragon green and the badge and the gun, there are stories most people never heard. There are things that happened on that set, in those casting rooms, in those streets that changed the movie in ways nobody planned. 21 of them. Let us get into it. The role of Alonzo Harris was not written for Denzel Washington. When screenwriter David Ayer first put the script together, the character was written as a white detective. Ayer had pulled heavily from his own childhood growing up in South Central Los Angeles, and from what he saw of law enforcement culture in that environment. But when the script landed in the hands of producers and the conversation turned to casting, someone looked at what Alonzo Harris actually was: a dominant, magnetic, morally collapsed authority figure operating inside a black community, and understood immediately that this story would hit differently with a black man in that role. Not just culturally, but dramatically. The power dynamic between Alonzo and the community he terrorized would carry a completely different weight. The betrayal would feel more intimate. The corruption would feel more personal. Denzel was approached, read it, and the rest of that conversation happened very quickly. But it is worth pausing on what that casting decision actually changed about the story. A white detective brutalizing and exploiting a black community is one kind of horror. A black detective doing the same thing. A man who came from those streets, who understands the people he is preying on because he is one of them, who has weaponized that intimacy into a tool of domination, is a different and arguably more devastating horror. Alonzo Harris does not terrorize strangers. He terrorizes his own. And that distinction runs through every scene in the film like a live wire. Denzel Washington initially said no. That is not a rumor or a behind-the-scenes exaggeration. The man turned the role down. He read the script and passed. His concern was the character himself. Denzel had spent most of his career up to that point playing figures who carried some kind of dignity, some kind of moral backbone, even when they were flawed. He had played Malcolm X. He had played a wrongly convicted boxer. He had played soldiers and attorneys and men of principle. Alonzo Harris was none of those things. Alonzo Harris was a predator wearing a badge. He intimidated witnesses, stole from drug dealers, manipulated a rookie cop, and orchestrated the murder of a man he had worked alongside for years. Denzel was not immediately comfortable being that man on screen, and he was honest about that discomfort publicly. He did not want to trade on his credibility as a performer, to give weight to a character whose worldview he found genuinely troubling. It took multiple conversations, a deeper dive into what the film was actually trying to say about institutional corruption and the psychology of unchecked power, before he agreed to come back and take the role. And once he committed completely. To prepare for Alonzo Harris, Denzel Washington spent time riding along with real narcotics detectives in Los Angeles. He wanted to understand how these men moved, how they talked to people, how they justified what they did, how they carried authority in environments where authority was both feared and deeply resented. What he found, according to his own accounts, was that the scariest version of corruption is the one that believes it is righteous. The most dangerous detectives were not the ones who knew they were dirty. They were the ones who had constructed an entire internal logic where what they were doing was necessary. That psychology became the foundation of Alonzo Harris. The character does not think he is the villain. That is why he is so convincing. Denzel has described specific moments from those ride-alongs that stayed with him. Detectives who would switch between warmth and menace within the same sentence depending on who they were talking to. Who could make a man feel respected and threatened simultaneously? who had developed a kind of fluency and power that was almost artistic in its precision. He took all of that and built Alonzo Harris from the inside out, starting with the belief system before he ever thought about the physicality or the voice. Director Antoine Fuqua fought hard to shoot the film in actual South Central Los Angeles neighborhoods rather than on sets or in controlled locations. That decision shaped the entire texture of the movie. The streets you see are real, the buildings are real, the people in the background are real residents of those communities. Fuqua wanted the film to feel like a document, not a movie. He wanted audiences to feel the geography of power, to understand that these were not abstract locations, but actual places where real people lived, and where real versions of what the film depicted had actually happened. The production team had to build genuine relationships with community members and local figures to be allowed to film there without interference. Some of those relationships became collaborations. Some of the people you see in certain scenes were not actors at all. The Smiley character, the man at the end of the film who refuses to shoot Jake Hoyt and instead lets him go, was written as a significantly smaller role. In early drafts, Smiley barely appears. He is a peripheral figure, a face in the crowd of Alonzo's network. But as filming progressed and the production team spent more time in the actual neighborhoods where they were shooting, the character began to expand. The decision to make Smiley the moral pivot of the entire final act, the man whose choice to honor a debt to Jake's father becomes the thing that saves Jake's life, came out of conversations about what justice actually looks like in communities that the formal legal system has abandoned. It is not a courtroom. It is not a badge. It is a man with a gun choosing not to use it because of something older than law. The actor who played Smiley was Cliff Curtis, a New Zealand actor of Maori descent who has spoken about approaching the character as someone who operates by a completely separate moral code from anything the formal institutions of the film represent. Curtis brought a stillness to Smiley that made the character's few scenes land with enormous weight. He does not perform menace. He simply occupies space in a way that makes menace unnecessary. That quality, the authority of a man who has nothing left to prove, is what makes the final scene between Smiley and Jake so powerful. It is not a rescue, it is a reckoning. Ethan Hawke was not the first choice for Jake Hoyt. Several other actors were considered for the role of the rookie detective, and there was a version of the casting conversation where the studio wanted someone with more immediate star power in that slot, someone whose name could carry weight alongside Denzel's on the poster. But Antoine Fuqua argued for Hawke specifically because he wanted Jake to feel genuinely outmatched. He needed an actor who could be authentically overwhelmed, who could make you believe that this young man was in way over his head without tipping into weakness or incompetence. Hawke had a particular quality of intelligent vulnerability. You could see him thinking. You could see him calculating. You could see the fear and the moral conflict moving across his face in real time. That was exactly what the role required. Ethan Hawke prepared for training day by doing his own ride-alongs and by spending significant time talking with young LAPD officers about the culture of initiation in the department. What he found disturbed him. He described in interviews the pressure that new officers face to conform, to not ask questions, to demonstrate loyalty through compliance rather than through competence. The culture Alonzo Harris represents in the film was not invented for dramatic purposes. It was a heightened but recognizable version of something real. Something that multiple officers confirmed to Hawke existed in various forms across different units. He carried that knowledge into every scene. The discomfort Jake Hoyt feels is not just acting, it is informed. The dragon green that Alonzo keeps in his car, the marijuana that becomes a major plot element early in the film, was a real, practical prop that created some genuine tension on set. The production team had to work carefully to ensure that what they were filming looked authentic without crossing into anything that would create legal complications. Certain scenes required multiple takes for reasons that had nothing to do with performance, and there are accounts from crew members of some very long conversations between the director, the legal team, and the prop department about exactly what could and could not be shown. None of this made it into any official press material. It became one of those open secrets that film productions accumulate. Training Day was shot in approximately 45 days. That is a short production schedule for a film with that level of complexity. multiple locations, night shoots, crowd coordination, stunt work, and the demands of 2 central performances that required enormous amounts of space and preparation. Antoine Fuqua has described the shoot as one of the most intense of his career, not because of any single crisis, but because of the cumulative pressure of working in real neighborhoods with a tight schedule while also managing performances that could not be rushed. Denzel Washington in particular required specific conditions to fully inhabit Alonzo Harris. There were days where the crew would complete setup. Everyone would be ready, and Denzel would need another hour before he felt the character was present enough to begin. Other crew members described the experience of watching him step onto set fully as Alonzo as something that changed the atmosphere of the entire location. The extras, the background performers, the community members who had agreed to be on camera, they responded differently to Denzel in character than they responded to Denzel between takes. He was not performing for the camera alone. He was performing for the street, the famous King Kong speech, where Alonzo stands in the street surrounded by Smiley's crew and delivers a monologue about his own power and importance before the situation collapses entirely, was almost cut. In earlier edits of the film, that scene was trimmed significantly because test audiences found it too theatrical, too operatic for a film that had maintained a certain gritty realism up to that point. Antoine Fuqua pushed back. He argued that the speech was not a break from realism. It was Alonzo's psychology fully exposed for the first time. The man had been controlling every interaction in the film through intelligence and manipulation. When that collapses, and he is reduced to performance, to theater, to raw declaration of his own mythology, that is the moment his true self is visible. The speech stayed. It became one of the most quoted scenes in the film and one of the most studied in terms of what it reveals about the psychology of narcissistic authority. The man who has believed his own legend so completely that he cannot comprehend being rejected by people he has always treated as props in his own story. Denzel Washington won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Training Day, making him only the second black man in history to win that award at the time, following Sidney Poitier's win nearly 40 years earlier. What is less discussed is how the industry reacted to the nature of the role. Several commentators at the time noted, with varying degrees of discomfort, that the first Oscar for a black lead actor in 40 years had gone to someone playing a corrupt, murderous cop. That conversation was significant and unresolved. Denzel himself addressed it directly in interviews, acknowledging the complexity while also defending the artistic integrity of what he had created. He had not won for playing a villain. He had won for playing a human being whose choices destroyed him. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and Denzel understood it clearly. Alonzo Harris is not a cartoon. He is not an obstacle. He is a fully realized man who made specific choices over a long period of time that compounded into a catastrophe. The Oscar was not a celebration of corruption. It was a recognition that portraying the psychology of a man like that, without softening it and without excusing it, is one of the hardest things an actor can do. Denzel did not flinch. And the Academy, for once, recognized what it was actually watching. Halle Berry won Best Actress the same night Denzel won Best Actor, making that Oscar ceremony the first time in the history of the Academy Awards that both acting trophies went to black performers in the same year. The moment Denzel called her name in his speech and the reaction in that room was described by multiple people present as genuinely electric. But what is interesting from a production standpoint is that Halle Berry's win was for Monsters Ball, a film that also dealt with racial complexity in ways that generated controversy. The fact that both wins arrived on the same night and were immediately read through a racial and cultural lens speaks to something that was happening in American culture in 2001 and 2002 that went well beyond two individual performances. The score for Training Day was composed by Mark Mancina, but the sonic identity of the film, the hip-hop and R&B soundtrack that runs through it, came from a different kind of curation. Music supervisor Spring Aspers worked to build a soundtrack that functioned as both atmosphere and character. The music in the car, the music bleeding out of buildings in the neighborhood scenes, the choices made for specific moments of tension and release, all of it was selected to root the film in a specific cultural and geographic reality. The soundtrack was not decoration, it was argument. It was saying continuously, this is whose world this is. This neighborhood has its own culture and its own music and its own logic. And the law enforcement presence inside it is the intrusion, not the other way around. That argument is embedded in choices that most viewers absorb without consciously registering. The specific song playing when Jake first rides through the neighborhood, the shift in musical texture as the day progresses and the situation deteriorates, the near silence of certain scenes where dialogue alone has to carry the full weight of what is being communicated. Sound in Training Day is never accidental. Every sonic choice is a statement about environment, identity, and who belongs where. There is a scene early in the film where Alonzo and Jake stop at a diner and Alonzo orders breakfast. It is a small scene. It is procedural. But David Ayer has talked about how that scene was one of the most carefully written in the entire script because it establishes the rhythm of their dynamic before anything dangerous happens. Alonzo is in complete control of the social environment, ordering for Jake, deciding the terms of the conversation, using charm and authority interchangeably. The waitress treats him like a regular. The restaurant treats him like a known figure. Jake is immediately and unmistakably a visitor in a world that already belongs to someone else. Everything that happens in the film after that scene is already contained in that breakfast. Scott Glenn, who plays Roger, the detective that Alonzo and Jake visit, and who is ultimately killed in his own home, brought a depth to that role that the production team has credited with elevating the entire second act. Roger is a man who built something with Alonzo, who shared history with him, who trusted him, and who in the last moments of his life understands what that trust cost him. Glenn approached the character not as a victim, but as a man making a final accounting. The scene in Roger's house, the chess game, the photographs on the wall, the careful domesticity of a man who thought he had made it out, is one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the film. And it lands almost entirely on Glenn's choices in a role that has relatively few lines. What Glenn understood was that Roger is the film's most honest mirror of what Alonzo could have been. Roger made it to the other side of that life, or thought he did. He has the house, the warmth, the sense of a life built on something stable. And then the man he trusted most in the world walks through his front door and destroys all of it. The horror of that scene is not the violence. It is the moment just before the violence, when Roger looks at Alonzo and knows. You can watch Glenn make that realization move across his face in real time. It takes about 2 seconds. It is perfect acting. The screenplay for Training Day was on the Hollywood blacklist for years before it was produced. The blacklist, for those unfamiliar, is an annual survey of the most liked unproduced screenplays circulating in Hollywood at any given time. Making the list is a signal that the industry recognizes something as valuable without necessarily being willing to commit money to it. Training Day sat in that space for a while because studios were uncertain about a film that was this morally complex, this unglamorous in its depiction of law enforcement, and this rooted in a specific community without any clear sympathetic authority figure for mainstream audiences to hold on to. There was no scene where the institution redeems itself. There was no commanding officer who sees what is happening and intervenes. The system in Training Day is not broken by one bad apple. It is a system that grows bad apples deliberately, that protects them, that only exposes them when they become liabilities. Studios understood that this was not the kind of law enforcement story that would make anyone feel reassured. The film got made ultimately because the right combination of talent and advocacy pushed it through at exactly the right moment. Antoine Fuqua had a specific visual philosophy for Training Day that he described as wanting the film to feel like it existed in the actual light of Los Angeles. The harsh, flat, unforgiving afternoon sun that makes the city look both beautiful and exposed. He deliberately avoided the stylized visual approaches that were common in crime films of that era. The high-contrast noir aesthetics or the music video-influenced color grading that many directors use to signal genre. Fuqua wanted the film to look like a documentary that happened to have actors in it. That choice meant that performances had nowhere to hide. Everything that Denzel and Ethan Hawke did was visible in full light, with no cinematographic softening. It made the film feel more dangerous than it would have otherwise. There is a specific quality to the look of Training Day that separates it from almost every other crime film of its era. The sense that the camera is simply present, observing rather than dramatizing. The cinematography by Mauro Fiore does not ask you to feel any particular way about what you are seeing. It shows you and steps back. That restraint is one of the most sophisticated directorial choices in the film, and it is one that is easy to miss precisely because it works so well. The ending of Training Day went through multiple versions. In some earlier drafts, the film's conclusion was more ambiguous about Jake Hoyt's future, whether he would be believed, whether the corruption he had witnessed and survived would actually be addressed or simply absorbed into the institutional silence that protects officers like Alonzo. The decision to end on Jake walking away with the evidence while Alonzo is shot down by the Russian mob, dying not as a result of justice, but as a consequence of his own debts, was a deliberate choice to deny the audience a clean resolution. Alonzo is not arrested. He is not exposed in a courtroom. He is killed in an alley by people he owed money to. That is not justice. That is just the way things end when you build your entire life on betrayal. David Ayer has been open about how much of Training Day came from personal experience and personal knowledge. He grew up in the neighborhoods depicted in the film. He knew people who had encounters with detectives operating outside the bounds of what the law permitted. He knew what it looked like when institutional power was used as a personal weapon. The film was not reporting on something Ayer had researched from the outside. It was a formalization of something he had observed from close range for most of his life. That proximity is part of why the film feels true in a way that films about these environments often do not. The details are right, not because someone did research, but because someone remembered. There is a version of Training Day where none of this happens, where the studio makes the safe choices at every turn. Safer casting, safer location, safer ending, safer everything. There is a version where this story becomes another procedural, another cop drama, another piece of entertainment that processes the reality of institutional corruption into something comfortable and resolved, something that allows the audience to leave the theater feeling like the system ultimately works. That version does not exist, and its absence is important. What exists instead is what you have seen, a film that is still being watched, still being argued about, still generating conversations about power and race and complicity, and the particular kind of evil that wears authority, like a costume. Denzel Washington built something in that role that the film industry did not fully know how to hold when it arrived. It knew how to award it. It knew how to sell it. But fully holding what it said, fully sitting with what Alonzo Harris represents and what his community represents and what Jake Hoyt's survival represents, that conversation is still ongoing. 21 facts, one film, and a performance that will outlast every easy answer anyone ever tried to put on it. What makes Training Day endure beyond its initial release is something that is difficult to name cleanly but easy to feel when you watch it again years later. The film does not date. The specific details of early 2000s Los Angeles are all there. The cars, the music, the fashion, the particular way certain blocks looked before decades of gentrification changed them. But the core of what the film is about does not belong to any specific era. Corruption disguised as competence, authority that feeds on the communities it claims to protect, the slow education of someone who enters a system believing in it and has to decide, at a precise and dangerous moment, whether to preserve themselves by going along or risk everything by pushing back. That is not a 2001 story. That is not an LAPD story specifically. That is a story about power that could be told in any institution, in any country, in any year. Training Day told it better than almost anything else has. And Denzel Washington made sure you would never forget the man who showed you exactly how it worked.